Good everyone, on today's video. Today we're going to be doing a advice video on crew skills. This will cover pretty much what I think you should put crew skills into for aircraft like fighters, vehicles with rear gunners, and of course tanks. In the description below there are 4 timestamps. There's going to be obviously, well, technically there's 5 because, well, there's the intro, because you have to have one with 0 seconds on it to make timestamps work for some reason. But there's obviously going to be the intro, which you can obviously skip because this is this. There's going to be one for fighters. There's going to be one for attackers / bombers, which is why we've got a H6K down there. There's also going to be one for tanks, and there's also going to be the different ways in which you can get crew skills, as well as the recommendations for getting them, and the most efficient way at least. One last thing as well, there's also going to be a link in the description to the Discord server if you wish to join it. It's my personal community, so feel free to jump in if you need some advice, if you need squad mates, or you just want to make some friends. That's what we're here for. So, let's jump into crew skills on fighters. And I know what you're thinking, why have I chosen this Kai 10 for this example? Well, number 1, I got this camouflage in the Warbond shop and I thought it looked nice. But 2, it's a rather appropriate one because biplanes do tend to put the crew skills a little bit of a test, to put it simply. Biplanes obviously turn very well, typically like a 0 as well, and, well, depends on the biplane. But typically, you're going to want to focus on only a few skills in fighters, at least for the most part. So, let's go take a look. So, as you can tell, we've got multiple things to talk about, but obviously we're not going to be talking about defensive armament, as I'm going to save that for later. This part will also cover the logistical services and everything like that, so it will not be covered in the bomber section, because I don't need to repeat myself. So, let's start off with keen vision. This essentially helps your pilot see things, which you'd think maybe Nigel, or in this case Shoji, is maybe having an eye operation, so now he's got 50-50 vision, or sorry, 20-20 vision, and now he can see pretty much anything. It's pretty much like that. The higher this skill is in terms of an aircraft, the easier it is for him to spot things. As you can see, line of sight detection range on my current crew is 4.25 miles. That's pretty impressive. Obviously, the highest is 4.72, so that's nearly 5 miles. So, spotting vehicles can obviously make a big difference in the air when it comes to engaging targets, because it also gives you an idea of what's best to really look for, like, should you go for this target, should you go for that target, etc. Next is awareness. Absolute identification pretty much means you'll be able to know what the aircraft is once you get within a certain vicinity. So, for example, the higher the point is, you might be able to identify an aircraft at long distance, but generally speaking, if you're a newer player, this could come in handy because at the end of the day, you might not know what you're fighting until you get close. And this may help you learn aircraft in terms of silhouettes, but also may help you fight those aircraft because then you'll be able to prepare in advance for them. Obviously, base is 1246 feet. Again, I'm not sure what I use feet for this, but generally speaking, that's what it is, and that's almost double what it is on base compared to the top, which is obviously with an ace qualification. Expert and ace qualifications, obviously, I already have an expert crew on this Kai 10, but obviously, they all give different bonuses. So, on keen vision and things like that, I get a +3. But if I add in the ace qualification, I get a +5. So you can definitely see the difference between an expert and an unskilled crew, as well as an ace crew. Next up is G tolerance, which is the one that I think you should really focus on the most, other than keen vision. This is because when you're turning in tight turns, your pilot will obviously be looking to preferably keep the blood in his head, if you know what I mean. So, generally speaking, the more you can take is the longer you don't black out in a dogfight. Now, if you're here when you've just come from top tier jets, this isn't going to mean too much. I mean, sure, it's going to help out in the long run, but generally speaking, your crews are going to suffer when it comes to high turns, because obviously at jet tier, you're pulling 10 Gs on average, which that's a lot, and you've got to remember the average human can only take about 7 or 8 Gs, so you've really got to be careful. And obviously there are techniques for reducing the G tolerance loads and things like that, but you've got to know those in advance. Negative G is not as common, but obviously that is still something to consider. Negative G is when you're pushing down on your controls to put yourself into a dive. So in this case, the pilot can only take 2.5 negative G. Now I know what you're thinking, that's quite low, but what you've got to remember is that when you're going positive G, you're blacking out. But when you're going negative G, you're doing what's called redding out. Redding out means where the blood is coming from the bottom of your body, so like your legs, your feet, etc., and it's going up into your eyeballs. I know that sounds grim, but it's generally how it is best explained. But essentially, the more your pilot can take, the less chance you have of redding out and losing control. Next up is stamina. So this is pretty much like the G tolerance, so this is very important. But this basically means the pilot can also, shall we say, he can get his energy back a bit quicker. You've got to remember that when it comes to G-forces, it's a lot of toll on the human body, even if this is just a game. But generally speaking, your pilot will be able to recover within a few seconds if you have him ready to go. As you can see though, base is 5 seconds, on my current crew it's 3 seconds, and on top with ace crew it is 2.5 seconds. So generally speaking, this is one you're going to want to have if you're preferably playing a nation like Japan or Britain, because generally speaking this is going to help. This will also help in jets, and this will also help in normal fights anyway, but this is definitely one that I recommend you put into. And next up, and finally for pilot at least, this is vitality. Health of the crew members, as well as the speed of their recovery if they are wounded. So this, I don't know why it says speed of their recovery, because your crew doesn't, they don't recover, like they don't regenerate health and things like that. I wouldn't put too much into this, to be brutally honest, because if your pilot's getting hit in the face by a 50 cal, chances are there's a second one coming right behind it. So yeah, this one isn't one you should really worry about too much, but I'd recommend putting at least 1 or 2 bars into it. And what I mean by bars is the various different bars here. They do cost different crew points and everything, and that's just how the game does it. We're going to move on now to logistical services. This involves repairs and reload speed as well as weapon maintenance. Repair speed. This means the fastest time your aircraft can be repaired on the runway. Base is 30 seconds, which I know that doesn't sound like a long time, but when you think about it, it is. Because that 30 seconds, the enemy players can use to gain an advantage on you if it's coming down to the wire, let's just say. It says total 14 seconds and minimum off-field on airfield repair time of 14 seconds. I can assure you right now that's a load of crap, because trust me, I've had it repair in 10. But then again, some of my vehicles I have ace crews on, but even for non-ace crew vehicles, it's 10 seconds. But obviously, you've got to have this maxed out. Next is repair rank. As you can tell, it says repair rank 5 and the top is 7. There's only 5 bars to get, and you don't get a bonus. Don't worry, once this is maxed out, you will get this on the 7 rank and the 6 rank as well. This essentially means if you're trying to repair a rank 1 aircraft and you have at least this bar filled with 1 bar, you will get the bonuses that you get up here as well as here. But generally speaking, if you don't have this, you will not get the benefits of here and here. So make sure to put some points into this when you can. Next is reload speed, because at the end of the day, guns don't reload themselves. Once you land and reload and everything, and this includes bombs and rockets and things like that, this will obviously reload faster. In aircraft AB, I should say, this obviously affects the in-air reload time of various weapons. So do make sure to do that. And obviously this does apply to turrets as well on aircraft, so again, do make sure to do that as well. I definitely suggest putting some points into this if you're an AB player. Otherwise, keep it about 50-50 on these two if you're an RB player. And finally is weapon maintenance. The armorer's skill increases the efficiency of the vehicle's weaponry, reduces the overheat and speed of primary weapons, as well as the spread of bombs and rockets and things like that, jamming chance, and also angular velocity. To dumb this down, essentially the higher this has, the less spread you have, the less chance of overheating you have, and the less chance of jamming. And yeah, this is a very useful one, and as you can tell on this crew, obviously this is a level 56 crew, this is pretty much maxed out, because this is so important for some aircraft. For something like an F8, F1B Bearcat, which obviously if you're new to the game you're not going to be playing that, but the stock guns on that thing spread like shotguns. And even having this does reduce the spread a little bit, but the moment you get 20mm new guns mod, they fire like laser pointers. So that's definitely one that I would suggest going to. So, now that we've done that, let's move on to a bomber, which I decided to choose the H6K because I recently got this skin on it. So, what's the difference between a fighter and a bomber? Well, they generally don't need stuff like pilot skills, so we're not really going to talk too much about pilot skills here. Generally, the ones that you do want is awareness and keen vision, which obviously I'll cover those anyway. But bombers, they really need to focus more on their gunners, and we'll see why in a moment. So let's go to the crew points and discover here. So, I know this is a pretty bad example because obviously I have G tolerance maxed out. You're not going to need it on something like a H6K. But generally speaking, you want to focus on keen vision, awareness, and of course, vitality. Normally you wouldn't focus on vitality in a fighter, but in a bomber, if you have multiple pilots, it can certainly save your ass. Let's put it that way. G tolerance and stamina you do not need to worry about. I've recently had a fighter in this crew, so that's why this is maxed out. But generally speaking, these are the two most important other than vitality. For the pilot at least. But of course, you're not here to see that. You're here to see defensive armament. So, we need to talk about the different parts, but the main ones I'm going to skip are the first three. I'm going to talk about them briefly, but there's a good reason why I'm skipping these three. So, number of experienced gunners. As you can tell, I only have one on this gun, all on this H6K crew. So, my crew is inefficient, which it doesn't matter because, I'll explain why. If you're an AB player, you'll probably want this maxed out. Same with the fire accuracy and fire precision. But if you're an RB player, don't bother. And here's why. Because at least in RB, the gunners are crap for AI control. Because yes, this applies to AI control, not ones that you control manually. This is because in arcade, typically the gunners have ballistics worth a damn, but in RB they can't shoot worth a toffee. So generally speaking, you're going to want to take manual control if you're an RB player. But obviously if you're an AB player, I'm not going to be unfair to you. I'm not going to skip this, but I'm just going to briefly talk about it, because at the end of the day, this is something you should focus on, but if you're an RB player, you shouldn't really focus on this. So obviously the higher you go, the more general crew you can have. Obviously 10 crew is the maximum of experienced gunners. Obviously in this H6K we have 9 crew but 5 defensive firing arcs. Every half point equals a crew member, so if you have at least 2.5, you have the H6K covered. So do make sure to keep that in mind. Anyway, the experienced gunners does help with these two next ones, by the way. So fire accuracy. This essentially means that your gunner will fire at a given range and will also be able to, let's just say, anticipate your targets a lot more efficiently. In AB, this is very useful. In RB, as I said earlier, this is very useless. But if you're looking to play a bomber in at least Air Arcade, I would heavily suggest putting some points into this. This is because you can't always operate your gunners when you're busy dropping your bombs, firing rockets, shooting at ground targets and things like that. And generally speaking, this just helps you out a little bit more. Fire precision decreases, I should say, scattering. So what that means is your gunner is more likely to be able to hold the weapon efficiently and be able to really use the shoulder stock and get some shots in. I'm sure if Shoji tried with the 20mm on this H6K, you could probably nail a fighter from like 1 kilometer. But generally speaking, gunners won't shoot that far. But of course, they will fire in set bursts, and as you can see down in the bottom, it says maximum burst duration. They will fire for around a second, which that doesn't sound like a lot, but when there's multiple gunners firing on a target, it does matter. These are two that I think you can skip for the most part. G tolerance and stamina are useless on these sorts of aircraft. But when it comes to vitality, you're definitely going to want this, especially if you're in something slow and lumbering like a H6K. This is because your gunners are pretty easy to kill, and most importantly, they're going to need some extra help, because if we go to the H6K's armor, it's non-existent, so getting that extra vitality helps them out a lot. So, let's move on to the tanks now that we've discussed that. And for this example, we're using a multi-turret tank, because there's actually 2 different things to discuss here, but, you know, we'll obviously come to that. So, let's go to crew. Obviously, we've already talked about keen vision, but in tank RB and AB, obviously AB it's obviously different. But in RB, that you might not notice this, but trust me, this is going to help. So if you have cruise skills in keen vision in ground RB, you will be able to detect vehicles that you might not even know are there. What I mean by that is, you know those little red arrows that you see sometimes in tank RB? That is your crew detecting something, and they're telling you, you might want to look over there. You might not always spot it given the map, but I'd definitely put some points into this across the board for your crew. Next is probably one of the more important ones, field repair. This essentially means if you have a max number of crew, obviously in this Rogo I have 6, this generally means how fast your vehicle can be repaired, and this is very important in given situations because sometimes you're going to need to get that repair done quickly, and if someone's just shooting your track over and over, you're going to want to try and reverse as soon as the track is done. This is one that I highly suggest putting in across the board. Next is agility. This obviously replaces the crew members, and for things like the driver and the gunner, this is the most important. Not just field repair. You're going to want these two on this crew. Well, on these 2 crew members specifically. The vitality for the loader, the commander, and the radio operator gunner are not as important, so don't be too worried about that. But generally speaking, agility and field repair are your 2 most important on tanks. Now we move on to the unique skill of the tank driver, which is tank driving. This essentially means how quick your driver slams on the anchors, and most importantly, how fast you can change a gear. Now to give you an idea, I can change a gear in a car in about a second, so he's doing alright for that. But as you can see, 0.1 seconds, he must be embracing his initial D to be doing that, and given it's a Japanese tank, that's rather appropriate. But essentially this just helps the driver not only brake and shifting gears, but also helps him judge the appropriate gear for the given situations. If you're going up a slight hill, the driver, if he's inexperienced, might put it in 4th gear and you might be struggling. But an experienced driver might think 1st gear would be best here. They'll put it into 1st or 2nd, depending on the tank, for better torque, and they'll be able to drive up the hill much more efficiently. So this is definitely one that you could put into if you're really wanting a bit of initial D references, but otherwise only put a couple of points in like I have here. Next, of course, is the gunner. I'm not going to talk too much about this because at the end of the day, we've already discussed this. But the 2 main ones we want to talk about are targeting and range finding. Targeting increases the speed of the turret, which in other words means the faster faster Shoji can crank it, the quicker you can get your guns on target. And obviously in this vehicle, I have 2 guns, 2 main guns. There's a machine gun in the back, but we don't talk about that. That obviously means the quicker my turrets can traverse, the faster I can get my guns onto target and shoot at targets. Now this also means whenever you have your gunner traversing onto target and you need to elevate the gun slightly, if your gunner does not have expert qualification, which obviously on this vehicle is quite cheap, he will only do it in this specific way. He will traverse it horizontally once and then adjust the angle of fire vertically. And with a tank like this, the Rogo, which has a very low velocity main gun with the 70mm, this can be fatal. So I would highly suggest putting an expert crew on your tank at the bare minimum. Then of course we have range finding, which is where your gunner pretty much just goes and looks in the periscope and thinks, alright, that's going to be that. But obviously in lower tiers, this won't help too much. But I mean it can, it depends on the optics and the generation of the tank really. But generally speaking, this is one I wouldn't really put into, and like I'd put a few points into it, so like maybe up to like here, rather appropriately. But generally speaking, this is one that I think you can mostly put a few points into, because as you get higher in BR, you're going to have laser rangefinders, which a laser is more accurate than a human, let's put it that way, because the old Mark 1 eyeball can only do so much. Once again, we're going to skip the previous 4, and we're just going to talk about the commander's unique skill, which is leadership. At the end of the day, you don't want freaking Daffy Duck in charge of your tank, so you kind of want someone who knows what they're doing. As you can see, with 1 bar filled on the leadership, I'm getting a 2% increase on my various skills. Now, 2% isn't a lot, but when you get up to the top at 10%, that does make a difference and can definitely help in the reload of your tanks. Speaking of loading of your tanks, we have the tank loader. Now remember, you will see 4 seconds on this. There's obviously a second turret on this tank, which that reloads in about 3 seconds, just in case you wanted to know. But weapon reloading is very important, and putting some points into this is a must, because trust me, when you're firing bigger guns like 152, you are going to feel that reload, and having that cruise skill in to get your reload down is going to make a huge difference. On this 70mm gun, we have a 5.2 second base reload, and on my current crew, it's on 4.98 seconds. If it's on my normal crew, I believe it's about 4.3, so it's pretty quick for a big gun like that. And having that support just really helps the crew out, and obviously helps your survivability out. And as I said, with the Rogo being a twin turret tank, having that 37mm firing in 3 seconds can make the difference between life and death. And finally, we move on to Radio Operator Gunner. He has a few other unique skills, but obviously there's 6 crew in this tank, so he's not going to be doing a huge amount to benefit the crew. But this is more for your light and medium tanks, because as we all know, heavy tanks do not get artillery, which completely cuts out these two. So, we'll start out at the bottom, because I think this is one that you really do not need points in. Radio communication. This is useless. Do not bother. All it does is, in Tank Arcade on a big map, you just get the pings of where enemies are. And whilst that could come in handy, if you're paying attention anyway, you will not need this. Do not bother. Next is artillery strike calling time. So this pretty much means when Shoji, obviously not in this tank, it'd be in a different one, when Shoji decides to call in a artillery strike, he can call it in much quicker. So in base, it is 13 seconds. On my current crew, it is 12.82, but if we was to go and put in the points here, it goes down to around 12 seconds. But obviously on a top ace crew, it's on 10 seconds. I wouldn't really put too much points into this. But the one I would put into is this. Artillery targeting accuracy. This skill affects the targeting accuracy of artillery. This reduces the scattering and can go down to as little as 148 feet, which I know that sounds like a lot, but when you're thinking about dropping a bunch of 152 howitzer shells in on targets, this can make the difference between you disabling or even killing an enemy and making it a lot easier for your team. Oh, and most importantly, if you're dropping artillery near your friendlies, it's less likely to kill them and you'll be called a twat. Let's put it that way. So, let's move on to the last things. Obviously, we've got the various different qualifications. This just means the vehicles that you can you've obviously used on this crew. And this is how you pretty much get your free crew aces and things like that. So obviously, if you've just skipped here from the intro, this is what we're going to be talking about before we move on to the last point. But essentially, the more you play the vehicle and the crew experience you get ace qualification for free, which can make a big difference on some vehicles. So, I bet you're thinking, how do you get ace crews and your crew skills up without working too hard? Well, there's actually a few ways. There's the unrecommended way, which is this. You can pay GE to get 10 crew skill points, and obviously other different prices. So you can pay 10 GE for 130, 100 for 1500, and 1000 for 17.5. I don't recommend doing this though. So I know what you're thinking. How do you do it? Well, it's as simple as you can either use a premium tank, which this one obviously is, or a premium aircraft in this case. They give higher, in terms of at least like RP gain, they give higher RP gain than your typical tech tree vehicle. However, if we go to a tank that I have a talisman on, and obviously this does apply to aircraft as well, you can also do it in these. So, for example, in a recent crate on the last season of the Battle Pass, I got given this for a talisman. Now, what that means is if I really want to, I could take this thing out on a level 9 crew and get some crew skill points. This is because the talisman, which we're going to cover talismans eventually in some sort of video, I'm not sure yet, but essentially this gives you plus 100% RP when controlling this specific vehicle. Premiums always come with a talisman, and they also come with better SL bonuses so you can afford to pay for things. But generally speaking, using a talisman vehicle or a premium vehicle is the most efficient way to do it. Using premium time when you can get it is also the most efficient way of doing it. If you can get onto the marketplace, you can sell things by grinding events, by getting chests, and most importantly just playing the game and you can pretty much sell things in the Build-A-Bear events, as we nickname them, aka the crafting events. You can sell those, get some free stuff, and just earn it through that. And if you're struggling to get yourself some free vehicles, do go take a look at my Mini Warbonds updated guide, and I'm sure that will help you out as well. Anyway, I think that's pretty much covered it for today. I hope you've enjoyed learning all these different things about different vehicles, different types, recommended crew skills and things like that. And of course, the best way to really, I'd love to take this thing out and grind crew skills in it, but you get my point. I hope you've learned something today. If you have, leave it in the comments below. If you think you haven't learned anything, tell me what I've missed or anything like that. But anyway, I'm going to leave you all to it. I hope you enjoyed today's video on crew skills, and I will see you all on the next one.